Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Sabrina Kofer, and on behalf of Choice and ACRL, I'd like to welcome you to today's program, Cybersecurity in Higher Education, which is sponsored by the Scholarly Network Security Initiative. Today's discussion is one in a series of sponsored webinars from Choice and ACRL that addresses new ideas and developments of interest to the academic library community. Before we get started, I'd like to point out a few features of the webinar software. All of the attendees who join the presentation are automatically muted and your cameras are off, so don't worry about generating noise or feedback. We've got that taken care of. In the main area of the screen, you can follow along with the presentation materials. We're using the Q&A feature today. Please use it to ask questions of our presenters. We'll answer as many questions as we have time for, so please do type your questions into the Q&A module as they occur to you. You also have the option to upvote a question that you'd like. Also note that there is closed captioning for today's session. To toggle the automated captions on or off, please use the CC button on the bottom right corner of your screen. Also note that today we have Spanish interpretation available to attendees. To enable the language interpretation, select the interpretation icon at the bottom of your screen. To listen to the translation in Spanish, select the Spanish option. Finally, note that we are recording today's program, and everyone who registered should receive a follow-up email with a link to the archive version. Our speakers today are Daniel Ayala, a managing partner at Socratic, Emily McElroy, Dean of McGugin Library at the University of Nebraska Medical Center, and Heather Flanagan, principal at Spherical Cow Counseling, a technical liaison for seamless access. And with that, we're ready to get started, so I'll pass things over to Dan.
Wonderful, thank you, and welcome everybody. I'm really excited to be here today. Make sure I've got the control over the slides, and I do. Good. All right. Welcome. My name is Dan Ayala. I'm in Ann Arbor, Michigan, as I mentioned earlier. I'm about 25 years in the information security space, and when it comes to this topic around information security and institutions in higher education and libraries, my background is I've spent time I was the chief information security officer for a publisher and scholarly content aggregator. I was a chief information security officer on an interim basis for a Big Ten university, and I'm currently consulting to the SNSI project as we try and figure out how to bring some of these worlds together: the information security within institutions, the university IT, and university libraries. But the talk today, my portion of the talk today, will be around how we got to where we are and some of the places where we are now when it comes to both networks, information security, and identity, because I think these are a really key baseline for how we move forward when it comes to access from across the university to resources, to systems, and more. So we'll start with an in the beginning. In the beginning, and not knowing how many of you have been in institutions for a long period of time, I'm going to take us back toward the beginning when technology started to arrive inside of universities, and we had individual networks. Even within one institution, we'd have different departments, different schools that had their own networks. When the internet came into play, they had sometimes their own connections to the internet. They had their own email services, their own directories, their own storage and other services. They were all fairly independent. And over time, they started to connect with each other, but still remained fairly independent in their operation, in their use, in their deployment. Many times, very different technologies. Five different email types within one university wasn't uncommon. Then we started, as the internet became more pervasive, we started to see those networks, the universities, start to purchase common internet connections and make a more internal network. You still had occasional occasional departments or groups that had their own external network connection, but you started to see a more cohesive internal network happen. But at that time, you were still seeing independent use of applications within various departments or schools, even within one institution. Then we started to move toward more shared internal services as costs for systems were starting to be rationalized, as the interest in more centralized service offerings as moved toward common registration systems and student information systems came. We started to see more of this centralization of the systems within that network. And sharing a connection out to the internet. And more recently, we've started to see the network at the left using the internet, and we've actually seen all of those systems shift out to be cloud-based. I tell you all of this by way of just demonstrating that we continue to see not just a coalescing of these systems into common services across the university, but also that what was once behind what was thought of as a fortress wall, as a perimeter wall, are now actually more external to the networks than they've ever been. I say this not to scare anybody or not to, this isn't about control, but rather it's that we're starting to see this move toward cloud services. And it means that universities don't have the same direct interaction with these systems as they used to. There's one more slide that I didn't put in which that box around the network disappears. And you now have, post-COVID, you have individuals that are working from all over the world and connecting through the internet to most of their systems. I was having a conversation yesterday in which there are organizations that don't have VPNs anymore, that don't bring people back to an internal network. They just access directly to those cloud-based services for 99% of the work that they do. So this is a progression of how networks have changed over the past 25, 30 years. If we then also jump back to that same point in time when it came to identity and access, at first, there was no such thing as, the network and access to common shared systems was very small, maybe a mainframe in the institution. And that was done centrally because of the price. But if there was something, as we started to get into software for work groups, as we started to get into small shared databases that were within a department or within access to common shared storage, those were all provisioned within each department or within each school. We didn't see a lot of the university-wide common identity for quite some time. It was very distributed. Then we started to, I guess in the slide before, we then start to connect these up through some form of informal federation where if you were an Active Directory institution, you would see trusts. So physics would put a trust in place with math so that a math professor here could gain access to some kind of a storage resource in the physics department. These were set up, again, ad hoc because of the relationship between these two groups, but they were managed by the department still, and we're still a little, we're still not centrally understood. There weren't good inventories of these kinds of accesses and identity stores, and you had to figure out who you needed to talk to in order to get access to things. And they were all independent. They might not be interoperable. We then moved into, actually, each of these boxes is a recreation of the slide before. Those common, can I go back? This federated notion, if you draw a box around this and multiply it out across multiple institutions, we now started to see these informal trusts showing up across the internet too, institution to institution, with the rise in cross-institution collaboration on research, with the rise in visiting professors and and people that had multiple appointments at different institutions, we started to see much more of a need for these informal trusts and becoming more formal trusts between institutions to allow a person to gain access to things in multiple places. The internet at the middle was really a joining hub for this. And with that, then something more formal had to happen. The idea of federated identity, so forms of single sign-on, SAML, shibboleth as one of the most pervasive in higher education, where each institution was able to leverage some kind of a federation in order to enable the provision of their identity in another institution, and then therefore gain access to resources in that institution. This has been in place for quite some time and is a very successful way of enabling identity across institutions. But within, if you notice in this slide, we still have 4 circles inside each institution, multiple departments, multiple divisions having some of their own pieces. With the move toward, over the past 5-7 years, we've seen this great push toward common identity, toward a single identity inside the institution. With the move toward shared services like student information systems, common HR systems, common messaging and groupware, messaging and collaboration systems, the need for universities to have a common identity, a single version of me and an understanding of all the resources that I have access to was dictated not just because of the additional complexity that has grown as proliferation of new services, but also the security that's required and the understanding of what data exists, who has access to it, and more importantly, when they leave the organization, how you can limit that access when they leave the organization. Similarly, on the research side, being able to understand and comply with laws on things like foreign influence to research, to make sure that you know definitively who has access to particular research, meant that there was this drive toward using a common identity and understanding all the things that I, as either a faculty or staff member or a student, had access to across the institution. Another interesting byproduct in this is that this single identity, prior, it was very easy, and there were a lot of different accounts and passwords that you had to manage. But at the same time, it was also relatively easy to give that away. It wasn't, each account really only gave access to a thing that may or may not feel very important to the user. So we did see a lot of people sharing accounts and sharing access. And over time, university resources were often used for things like file sharing, for things like torrents, for things like hosting of websites that weren't based in the university, because people weren't taking good care of the accounts and access that they had. They either lost track of them, they had too many of them, or they didn't have the same importance as they do today, where this single identity gives access, if you're a professor, to things like your HR system, as well as to the grades system, and all of your research storage and university common storage and other things. So this single identity now has a lot of value to the user, has a lot of value to the university, and it has a lot of importance to be protected by the university and understood. The other interesting thing here is now, as more of these services, again, move out to the cloud, we lose that direct ability to have we don't have these things on our network. We don't have our mail systems on the network anymore. So we don't have the ability to just plug a pipe into it and say, show me all the logs, show me all the information, or dig into it in the same way we used to. We now have to do this through cloud service providers. So while it is very easy for somebody to sign up, it is equally as important that these accounts, that these types of services are using the common identities so that the security teams can understand all of the ways that people are accessing this data. Similarly, the more that we have common identity, common systems, and common monitoring, you now have the ability to see what's happening more easily, more quickly. When an attack happens, it's going to have signatures that are detected by a security team. And the bigger the surfaces that the security team can look at, whether that's numbers of people, numbers of systems, numbers of transactions and interactions, the more chance that they're going to have to pick up some of those anomalies early on and stop them. Additionally, there's a lot of resource that comes with when you have to protect larger amounts. You can get better economies of scale. You can buy 100,000 of a particular license at much better rates than if you were buying 10,000 packs of licensing for it. So, the university can have a better financial by buying and doing these kinds of security and technologies centrally. But for me, the most important part is how we protect these. Excuse me. By plugging the security organization into all of these systems, both from the identity side and the system side, we get that visibility and the ability to react quickly. When we had systems that were out in various units managed independently, that kind of visibility didn't exist, nor was it anybody's primary purpose to respond and react quickly in order to, when something was detected. So, we've moved into this world where we have people whose job it is to watch and people whose job it is to respond, defend, and close down when something is detected. And all of this comes as a result of having common shared services. The benefits are significantly amplified. I think there's a whole other set of discussions that can be had on-premise versus cloud security. And I think that's perhaps a topic for another day, but I'll leave it with that cloud security, the people who are running cloud systems, especially most of the bigger ones that universities are buying, are investing massive amounts in securing those technologies and are able to do so. Again, back to the scale issue, they're able to do it at a much bigger scale and a much more comprehensively than any one of us could have done in our own organization in a smaller scale, because they have the scaled and multiplied resources to be able to put into the technology, to be able to put into the monitoring, and to be able to put into the defense. So all of this comes together to say that, excuse me, the fact that we've had this move toward centralization of identity, the move toward the centralization of network and application services, means that we have the best visibility we've ever had into things that are trying to attack systems, into the endpoints that are being used, valid endpoints that are being used. And then therefore we're able to understand when invalid endpoints are attempting to be used to get onto a network to be able to access a resource. Now, in the context of research, I had the pleasure of being in the Chief Information Security Officer role as COVID was beginning in a higher ed institution. And in the discussions we were having then, as research was happening around COVID, it became clear the FBI was approaching us on a regular basis with warnings. We were hearing from law enforcement around the world and seeing technically valid evidence that the threat against research was increasing. And a lot of the we tried to get to understand what the motivations were. Why were people trying to get at the research that was happening on campus? From purely being able to limit the ability to perform research, either to affect the reputation of the institution, or because it was research that they didn't want to see happen. We saw groups that were focused on trying to access the research early while it was still happening in order to be able to poach ideas for future commercial use or just to be able to sell to others. We saw very very distinct attempts to look at to try and impact the integrity of research data as it was performed, and even there are ideas around changing results in published research data after it's published, depending on the source you go to. Are you seeing the legitimate version of the content? If somebody has it stored locally on on a local store and it gets changed, how would people know? And then the last one is the default. People want to take research ideas and use them for their own commercial gain. We saw all of these things through COVID. They all existed before, but we saw a significant amplification over the past 18 months on these particular threats. And the ability to have these centralized systems around security and identity let us better understand when they were happening, more quickly identify that they were happening, and be able to respond if and when they happened. Now, of course, there is, I've done a number of talks on the balance, the push and pull of security and privacy. And in this case, we can very easily switch out the word privacy for the word libraries. Libraries are well rooted in the idea that patrons should be able to take a book off the shelf, read it, close it, put it back, and no one should ever know they're there. And security is often about gathering information in order to prevent or defend a particular task. And these two things do come at odds at times. But there is, in the next slide, I'll talk about just some of the ways that there are more of these commonalities and how security can actually help ensure privacy. But just calling out the fact that the awareness of the fact that things like access to usage data about research and about researchers, the more we have from a security side, the better we can detect and identify issues. But of course, this is immediately at odds with the idea of some of the patron privacy principles. We also historically, I've been in this industry for long enough and had enough conversations with library counterparts that there is I think a bidirectional lack of understanding of what each group does, of what IT, what information security, what library, how we're rooted, and getting past that often gets to the idea or the understanding that we are out for very many of the same things in terms of defending, research integrity and others that I'll talk about on the next slide. But spending time to understand each other's worlds, walk a mile in each other's shoes, will help make this easier and clearer. The next piece around academic freedom versus securing the institution, more data, please, to be able to identify and secure. But of course, this then potentially means that people might feel impaired in doing the type of research or searching that they want to do because they know that what they're doing is being logged or used in some way. And of course, ultimate patron privacy concerns around how what I check out, what I use, what I read might be used for other purposes beyond just securing the institution. If the data is collected at all, there is the concern that it might be used for purposes beyond that. But what do we have in common? We have a common commitment to research integrity. We have a common commitment to protect the institution, the information resident within the institution. By performing better and more comprehensive security, we can actually increase data protection, including making sure that the data that is used, that is collected validly about what people are researching, about the work that's happening on the campus, about how people are using technology and systems, can be prevented from being accessed by the people who shouldn't have it. And the more access to that data, the earlier, again, we can find it and root it out and prevent and stop it from happening. But if we don't, security doesn't have access to some of that data, then it is harder to do so. And the result of that may be that the information that's legitimately collected is then exposed to a third party, to an attacker, and used by them in a way that is not under the control of the university. The other is that I think both, in my experience, both libraries and security officers have had strong partnerships with the privacy office, with the people who are dictating the rules around privacy from a HIPAA perspective, from a FERPA perspective, from a number of other privacy regimes. And this is actually a really good triumvirate to work together between the security, the privacy office, and the library to try and come up with common understanding, common goals, and common approaches to address a need to increase the level of security, but ensure we do it in a privacy protecting way that is good for both the university and for the library and its patrons. That's the material I have to cover, and I'm going to turn it over to Emily now, who's going to talk a little bit about some of the practice, some of the, what happens in practice with security inside the institution. Emily.
Let's see. Hi. So over the last 10 to 15 years of my career, I've seen increasing campus controls put on library systems due to the threat of cyber events, either through malware, stolen credentials, and other things that we're discussing today. At the University of Nebraska Medical Center, IT security has grown in importance based on the number of attacks thwarted, but also the sophistication of those leading attacks. As we saw in the fall of 2020, and as Dan referred to, the FBI warned higher education institutions and healthcare systems of increased cyber attack risks. And as a result of these warnings, our campus audited all of our systems and identified any risks. And while I am at an academic health sciences library, these areas have implications for any type of library. I want to address 4 areas where we implemented changes based on the audit and how it affected operations and services. So the first area had been completed just about a month prior to the security audit, and that was implementing a new authentication system. So why did we do this? Well, for the last 3 to 4 years, we had been exploring different options. And like many campuses, we share different settings with other institutions. And on our campus, we share one with our clinical partner, Nebraska Medicine. We do not share licensed content because we are administratively separate institutions with limited joint operations. But having said that, our IT groups merged several years ago and stopped differentiating IP addresses based on space, buildings, or if you were a UNMC or a Nebraska Medicine user. You can imagine that this was a nightmare for the library and for licensing content because we had always used IP authentication. We tried implementing on-campus authentication using Easy Proxy, and we had to quickly change course because our users completely freaked out at the idea of coming to the library's website to authenticate on campus for a journal article. And it wasn't so much authenticating on campus, but forcing people to add that additional step of coming to our website, which was apparent with the number of complaints we received and just plummeting usage stats. So we opened things back up while we worked out a solution. And we made the decision to move to a federated authentication system, Open Athens, via EBSCO. And this transition made sense for a few reasons. We had to get away from IP authentication and break our users into different groups. And this was the most efficient system for us. And as Daniel actually alluded to, campus systems had changed during this time with more systems being merged together. So whether you were on campus or not, you had to start authenticating or using 2-factor authentication. We started to move away from VPN access. And after the campus audit, in fact, it's very difficult to get VPN access. So everyone was starting to get used to just signing into everything. And where Open Athens succeeded over Easy Proxy was that it was more seamless with a user's workflow and that they didn't have to bother anymore with the library's website to access a journal, whether they were on campus or not. Moving to a system that was more closely connected to our campus authentication system gave us hope that our users would better protect their credentials. So by the time of fall 2020, 98% of our resources were authenticating against Open Athens. And I'll return later to why this decision was critically important in the months to come. The second area affecting us was an additional step in the procurement process put into place by IT security that requires a vendor technical evaluation, or VTE. They just changed the name to solutions assessment. And so, but for me, I have to just say VTE because I'm not used to the new phrase. But prior to fall 2020, we only had to go through this evaluation for any software or any vendor product that required someone to download or hardware that we connected to our campus network. As an example, purchasing EndNote or Grammarly required a VTE because the users had an option of downloading something. And the campus procurement office wouldn't move any purchases through until a form was filled out by the vendor and a meeting took place between the library, IT security, and that vendor. So what types of things are covered? Well, there's basic system information that's gathered on the purpose of a product, what types of data they access or that we supply. And then the form branches into different questions depending if the system is on our premises or we use a hosted service. Other questions focus on items such as network controls, data protection, malware detection mechanisms, access restrictions, authentication with their staff, testing that takes place with their security systems, the data center security that they have, incident response, and system availability. And they have to upload a lot of different reports as to how they implement all of these things. So after this form is filled out, we have the meeting. IT security issues a risk matrix that leads to either something moving forward with procurement or denial. So in the fall of 2020, as campus IT security began doing their audits, they realized that they needed to expand what required a VTE. And it now included library collections, such as e-journals, ebooks, and databases. And it didn't matter if someone was just grabbing an article from the journal Cell on the Science Direct platform or a Springer ebook. It also didn't matter if it was a new or renewing resource. And as you can imagine, this would require thousands of VTEs that just could not be finished before our January renewals. The other issue is that small publishers had no idea what to do with this form that asked very complex questions. And many of these publishers or vendors outsource this part of their business. So the layers of people that we would have to work with became overwhelming. And we protested. I protested all the way up to the chancellor. I explained how accessing a journal that's subscribed from the library on their web computer is really no different and is actually in many cases more secure than someone accessing the same journal via their society membership. And it didn't matter. It wasn't until we had the first few VTEs with publishers when the IT security group realized that the type of resources that we're connecting to and how we were authenticating against their campus system. It took the CIO to step in and say that he would give a blanket pass to the library for anything that it connected via a modern authentication system such as Open Athens. Anything coming through Easy Proxy would continue requiring a VTE because he did not view that as modern authentication. So if we had not made, going back to my first point, if we had not made that move to Open Athens, we would have potentially lost access to most of our collections for an indefinite period. And it will increasingly become a disadvantage for vendors who do not allow federated access for these types of reasons. We see the poor usage stats for the resources that are still connecting via Easy Proxy. A third and major disruption for us was a review, continuing with this audit review of different services, either hosted on our campus or front-facing web applications. Our ILS system was determined to have 5 serious vulnerabilities that required shutting down the system in less than 24 hours. Fortunately, we were near the end of an ILS migration, so we had been working with test data loads and extractions. Staff had to go in on a Sunday and extract all of our data before IT took the system down. So what were some of these vulnerabilities? Well, their web applications were vulnerable to clickjacking, which is when an attacker uses different layers to trick you into clicking on something that's really attractive and submitting information. Only using medium strength SSL ciphers which is a set of steps to establish a secure connection between two groups. A server not enforcing use of strict transport security. So you just using an HSTS standard to always connect to a website over HTTPS, an insufficient protocol detection. I'm not an IT expert, so I had to go look these things up, and I still have to refer to it. But I knew that we had issues once it was explained to me. And we faced limited options, especially as we were facing a migration in 2 months. We either had to purchase a new server to update the operating system and corresponding applications because our existing one couldn't handle the upgrade. We could migrate to their cloud hosted service, but neither option would work because we would still have 2 vulnerabilities in existence since the vendor had no plans to address these issues in any upcoming releases of their system. They also couldn't fit an upgrade or move to a hosted service for at least another 3 months. And we were already scheduled to be on our new ILS by that date. So we had no choice but to keep our ILS offline. For a few weeks, we checked things out with simple pen and paper. I used to joke around that we were the only academic library in the world that was doing manual check-in that way. After that, we did go online with our new system, but we only could use test load data. So it included bibliographic holdings and item records without any user data. So we had to manually create user accounts until we went live with our full version of the ILS a month and a half later. We were lucky in 2 respects. One, most of our users were remote because of the pandemic, so we weren't circulating a lot of materials. Also, 99% of our collections are electronic, but the items that do circulate a lot, our anatomical models, had already passed their peak usage. If it had happened earlier in the semester, we would have been in really bad shape. The culmination of things happening expedited our digital preservation system. So just a week before the security audit, we had noticed some digital files from our special collections unit were missing from a server hosted by our campus data center. We discovered audit logging had been turned off at some point, and we really had no idea as to when that had happened. So our team evaluated where we stood with the NDSA levels of digital preservation and the rapid assessment model. It was startling when I saw the levels that we were at with the various standards. We landed in the awareness and basic levels for most of the organizational infrastructure area, and in the know your content level for the levels of preservation area with very little in protect, monitor, or sustain levels. So we focused on 4 areas. I have to admit, we had to actually create actual policy. So when I say finalize, that was ambitious. This is something that we had just put off for years because of other priorities. We had to determine intellectual control of all of our digital objects through fast inventories and processing, and then implement a digital preservation system and staff training. So as part of this, we evaluated the present state of all of our digital objects. We identified those at significant risks and created a pretty rapid implementation strategy. So within several weeks, we adjusted all of our backup storage locations. We purchased things from different systems, and we made sure this time that audit practices were in place. A year later, we have purchased Preservica, a digital preservation system, and we're making progress through the recommendations that I approved earlier this year. So as someone who came up through the collections world and librarianship, I always thought of cybersecurity and how people just really focused on how people accessed our collections. I dealt at a previous institution with breaches of our Easy Proxy server, and I'd handled communications between a publisher, our IT department, and the user with compromised credentials. And it almost seems quaint now when I think of how sophisticated attackers have become and how all of our library systems are at risk. I didn't even touch on some of the other systems that were affected, or the fact that we learned that in a real-time situation, our website, the university's website, would move to a model where it would take 24 hours for updates to appear, Well, when we think of something happening to our collections, we always think we'll use that website as the main primary method of communicating with our users. And we realized, no, we won't be able to do that. And so we'll have to figure out other solutions. Our IT group maintains a threats dashboard now, and this is just one of the data points that they share with us. There are others that talk about how all of these different types of threats come in and the different systems that they attack. And the last thing that I want is for a library service to introduce risks to our campus IT system. Nor do I want to lose content that we have spent a decade digitizing or the born digital items that have been donated to us. And we'll answer questions at the end, but I will turn it over to Heather right now.
Wonderful. Thanks, Emily. So people, we started talking about the very specifics of what happens at the institution level, I guess I would say. And we've also talked about, a specific campus situation. I'm here to talk a bit about what the world looks like in the bigger picture, I guess I would say. I want to make sure that everyone's working from the same information about what is federated identity. Are we all using their terms the same way? I want to talk about privacy, which is so very, very important to librarians and campuses, but putting that in the bigger context that is so active and impactful today. And also just the complications of when you're looking at something like federated identity, how it's going to become increasingly complicated in the near future. So federation, federated authentication, federated identity, I mean, all of these are terms that revolve around the concept of externalizing the authentication and authorization for your users. The federated authentication, that's literally a user is allowed to log in with an externally managed identity and password. The federation is the entity that actually maintains the trust fabric and makes sure that the metadata about all the institutions that are involved in this fabric are exchanged. And then the actual identity is the identity that is being managed by a third party, such as a university, a company, or, a social media service. One of the hats that I wear, because one of the reasons I didn't immediately introduce myself is I have a lot of hats, and I'm not actually sure which one I'm wearing. I think I'm wearing several right now. I am the chair of the new Federated Identity Community Group within the W3C, one of the main standards organizations for the internet and the web. I'm also the technical liaison for Seamless Access, which is an identity provider discovery service that many of you will heard of in the library and publisher space. I'm also the coordinator of REFEDS, which is the R&E Federation consortia of academic identity federations around the world. And pulling this all together, I held a workshop back in May that did not focus on academia. It focused on the big picture of, okay, so you're saying, the world is saying that the web has a problem. And the problem is that we need to do more to protect user privacy. And if you boil that down into a single problem statement, that problem statement is that non-transparent, uncontrollable tracking of users across the web needs to be addressed and prevented. And I think that's almost like motherhood and apple pie in terms of, well, yes, of course. But there's an addendum when it comes to federated identity, and that is the applications and services that need to work through the browser to support single sign-on or federated authentication use the same tools, the same browser functionality as ad tracking. And so the web browser can't tell the difference. It's not, it doesn't know. There's nothing technically to distinguish a properly sanctioned, expected, acceptable authentication process from an ad tracker watching the user travel across the web. So, all right, let's look at the privacy in context of academia and the technologies that are used to support it. So, IP address authorization. So this has been, I've seen many arguments saying this is one of the most privacy preserving options available, because an IP address range will apply to an entire campus, not to an individual. And so you can't trace it back. And that makes it, it's in some cases, people have said it's comparatively easy as long as your IP address ranges don't change, which can happen, or your campus decides to sell off your IP ranges, which can happen, but it's still one of the single most common authorization methods out there. Okay. Proxy services, right? Proxy services are considered pretty darn good. They protect the privacy of the individual from the service provider. In the library context, publishers are not going to be able to track that individual and what they're using and how they're doing it. Though you must admit, it doesn't actually protect the user's privacy from the organization that manages the proxy. Proxies use something called link decoration, which extends the URL and provides a whole lot of information in it. That's tracking technology, but pretty common in academia. But there's also federated authentication. This can also be privacy preserving, though it must be managed correctly. There have been notable questions of institutions that just release attributes whether or not a service provider asks for them, and that can be kind of embarrassing for all parties. So the institution is who's in control of what information is released about the user, and sometimes they don't know how to do that correctly. Okay, but now let's look at privacy in with a different lens. Let's move out of academia into the picture of what is the World Wide Web primarily used for? I mean, if you're looking at pure weight of numbers, you're looking at e-commerce and social. Well, IP addresses is considered not privacy preserving at all. It is considered by some to be personally identifiable information because it allows for tracking down individual machines and/or supports browser fingerprinting. So it's considered pretty bad, and some browsers such as Safari are already taking steps to make that not happen. Okay, so proxy services. Again, it's something that can protect the privacy of the individual from the service provider, but does not protect it from the organization managing the proxy. This is tracking, and stepping back to the big picture, that's considered a very bad thing. And there are groups that are trying to consider how to prevent that. That brings you to federated authentication. It can be privacy preserving. It must be managed correctly, but it's considered the best single option that will work in both contexts, in academia, in commerce, in social media. And that's important to remember when you're thinking about, well, what's important to me as a campus librarian, as a campus security person. Okay, what about consent? Well, consent is interesting because everyone agrees that consent should happen. The users agree to it. The service providers agree to it. The identity providers agree. Even the browsers agree. Consent is really important. What they don't agree on is who should manage consent. Should consent be should the IDP own that? Should the user own that? Everybody wants to own the fact that yes, the user consented to something, which is really annoying for the poor user because they're being pummeled with each body involved in this process is saying, do you consent? No, really, do you consent? Do you consent? Which trains the user to just click. And consent isn't actually appropriate in all cases. There are enterprise settings, there are government services where no, you don't, you will be tracked. In fact, that's possibly a legal requirement. So what do you do when consent isn't appropriate, but one of these bodies now involved is still automatically saying, do you consent? Do you consent? Do you consent? what's happening in the broader world is what was essentially a three-body problem, where the user, the identity provider, and the service provider all wanted to have a say or a record that consent to share information had been offered and accepted, has turned into a four-body problem. The user, the identity provider, the service provider, and the browser. The browser is now actively figuring out, how do I get involved in this? Because companies like Google, like Apple, are starting to be held responsible, liable. They're going to court because governments say, you know what, you have a moral responsibility here. You're enabling tracking behavior, and you need to figure out how to control it. So the browsers are now motivated to do something. And if any of you have worked with physics or math problems, not that those two things are actually dissimilar, four-body problems are so much more complicated than three-body problems. So the challenge, when you introduce another body to the problem of federated authentication, then the technical standards have to change. The user experience itself has to change, and the expectations for everybody involved have to change. Great, they have to change to what? What do you need to do? What do you need to expect? What is the change going to be? That's a great question. That's a wonderful question. Unfortunately, there's no answer yet to that question. This is a space that's under active development. I am 2 hours off a phone call, a conference call with the privacy community group in the W3C, where they are actively discussing questions about, we need to worry about navigation tracking and link decoration, and how do we do it? Because we have to do it, and we have to, like, we can't wait. We need to do something, but they don't know what. Different organizations are trying different things. You're starting to see browsers diverge in terms of what they support. You'll see that Safari users, you're probably going to start getting more complaints from Safari users who, things aren't working. Why can't I do this? You know, if you're familiar with seamless access, why doesn't my seamless access button already know what institution I've chosen? Well, that's because Safari has made some design choices that say no more third-party cookies ever under any circumstances. And things will therefore just not work. If you're used to Microsoft Teams, that might be more familiar to many of you, and you don't use the Microsoft Team app, but you go through the browser, well, that's not going to work on Safari either. And Microsoft's response was, yeah, just don't use Safari. Not a great support question, but that's all we've got right now. So here's a short version of, okay, what does all of this mean? And this gets a little bit technical. The authentication that uses SAML, which is most of the federated authentication used in academia, that's going to largely work as expected for the next couple of years. Couple of caveats and whatnot, but for the most part, this is going to continue to work. If you're familiar with OpenID Connect, that's the protocol that's usually used when people are logging in via social media. That's going to definitely start breaking, unless and until they actually change the protocol itself or make different design decisions in the browser. Services like seamless access or services like Microsoft Teams used within the browser, those are going to have very mixed results in terms of, does it work? Does it not work? It depends on the browser. It depends on the browser release. There's going to be a lot of open questions. So you're going to see some interesting support calls that will be hard to track down. As I mentioned, all of this is under active discussion and debate within the W3C. And the W3C looks at the big picture. it looks at what's important to the broadest set of users we can impact, which means it's focused on commerce and social media. It will make its decisions based on commerce and social media, which leaves academia in a situation where you have to catch up. This is an unfortunate business reality, and the best that can be done is to be a part of the conversation so that you and your developers at least have some heads up as to what you'll need to change on your side in order to adapt to a brave new privacy preserving world where the privacy they're worried about is that of the consumer user on the web. So here's a little bit about the W3C Federated Identity Community Group. It's a cousin, I guess I would say, to the privacy community group. Community groups are free to join, but you do have to accept some IPR agreements. Some, if you are in a state school, that may or may not be something you can do. You can always join as an individual. Still, I would encourage you to, if nothing else, the notes are always public, to just follow along. Or if you have questions, you're welcome to reach out to me and I will answer as many as I can when I can. There's a bit of immediate information. So this is, I've been called the cheerful voice of fear, uncertainty, and doubt, because I just told you a lot of stuff is going to change, a lot of stuff is going to break, and that there's not a lot you can actively do right now about it. Your IP address authorization is already starting to break. So what do you do? Working with some of the librarians in the outreach committee for seamless access, we put together an FAQ on the browser privacy changes. It's publicly available on the Seamless Access website, and it includes some pointers to Apple's guidance on, oh yeah, I guess we are breaking stuff for academia, huh? Okay, give this to your network department and it should help. So if you are seeing some of this, I encourage you, go through the FAQ, share it with your IT department, and it might offer you at least some answers and some direction of how you can cope with the upcoming changes. And other than that, I mean, there's a light at the end of that tunnel. Train, sunrise, that's sort of to be determined. We'll see is all I can say. I want you to be aware that these changes are happening. And I would be happy to take questions as part of the Q&A.
All right. Okay, we're to that part of the event where we come on screen and have our little bits of summit discussion here. And again, my name is Bob Boise, and I work in account development for Springer Nature. I am part of the SNSI group. And we have a friendly neighborhood librarian with us today, Susie Kopecki, who is also going to join the fun. We have received some questions in Q&A as well, but I think it would be nice to start with Susie just giving her impressions and making any comments, and if you have a question, go ahead and shoot.
Thank you so much, Bob, and thank you to all of the wonderful presenters. This was so informative. I was trying to take down notes, and I'll be revisiting the recording as well. So thank you so much to think about. I heard a question beforehand. Feel free to ignore it, though, because there's so many really good questions I saw in the chat. The question that I heard was, what constitutes cybersecurity harm?
Well,
The eye of the beholder.
Yeah, yeah. Heather's got her hand up, so I think she'll take a shot at it anyway.
So the reason this came up in kind of the conversation earlier was that one of as the W3C group is trying to determine what is tracking, what is appropriate behavior? What is inappropriate behavior? One of the criteria someone suggested is, well, we need to determine, does it do harm? At which point I started banging my head against the table really hard, because I've been involved with several groups, and one of the largest being ICANN, which is responsible for the names and numbers of the internet. So your DNS system, that's ICANN. And they've spent years trying to define harm, and they can't. The European Commission has major efforts that also do the same, try and define harm when it comes to an internet protocol, and they can't, because the context of harm is so complicated. Harm to whom? Are you talking physical harm? Are you talking emotional harm? Are you talking economic harm? Are you talking all possible forms of harm? At which point you've now boxed yourself into a position where you can't do anything. And so thinking of that as, if you're trying to do that as a starting point, you've set yourself up for failure. So it's culturally sensitive. It's a very difficult question to answer.
Yeah, I appreciate struggling with that answer a little bit, from a publisher's point of view. We're working, walking a similar kind of a tightrope, and it's kind of like we are aiming ourselves. Many of us are aiming ourselves towards an open resource approach to scholarly communication, so that not just article output and book output is open to the to the public, but is also kind of open, perhaps data, and so we're kind of moving steadily towards this open environment, which feels like, okay, then some aspects of security will take care of themselves, maybe in the long run. But on the other hand, the scholarly record is still something, a gem to be preserved and cared for, and not compromised, as I think Dan got to the point of telling us about some of those compromises on the campuses. So this conflict between, it's not just privacy and security, it's openness and security is at stake, I think, a little bit. Susie, have you run into security, conditions or things that you had to cope with at your college?
Yeah, we, especially within the last couple of years, we noticed a lot more phishing attempts. And so our IT team had actually been reaching out to campus, staff and faculty, and had been providing trainings as well as tips, and talked about spoofing. They talked about not entering sensitive information, and yeah, because there were some wacky ones. There were ones where somehow they would get, either they would actually be sending it from the a dean or even a president's email address, and sometimes they would have somewhat alarming content. Like it would say something like, hello, can you text me right now and give me this information? I'm in a meeting. Or one went out to some staff and faculty, and it said, it was from a manager, and it said, can you purchase some gift cards for me and send them? And most people understood, like, that seems out of character. But some
Yeah.
people later said, I started to buy gift cards.
Yeah.
So so IT's been trying to do more trainings, checking who the email is actually from, following up. But there have been more attempts. I know we switched over, so they're more SSO logins. And especially over the last year and a half, when so much has been done online, a lot of people have really had to hit the ground running to familiarize themselves with contents that perhaps if they primarily worked in person, maybe they didn't see as relevant. But
Okay. We've had a few questions, and we've been very open about the questions, right? Everybody can see all the questions coming up and all that stuff, and some have been answered already typed in answers in the answer section. So I hope that people appreciate the openness. In general, a couple of comments have come in about, where are these bad actors? Are they on the next campus, or are they really far away from us? And I know, Daniel, you started to answer some of that. Do you want to take that up any further?
Sure. I mean, just to summarize, the answer is yes. They're both,
Yeah.
this is not a locality problem. I mean, it's increasingly coming from foreign actors, those that are, foreign competition, but also state actors from other countries. But at the same time, there's never been a diminishment of domestic actors who want to capitalize on some of these things too. Their motives are different, but there's it's not as though people inside the US or inside certain particular geographies are not trying to break in and get things.
Yeah. Okay. I think that question is that answer is helpful. We have another question for really any of the speakers, and that's about things where people are trying to kind of plant, content onto the university to make it look like it's the university's content, or somehow comes from a university context or is endorsed by a university. Things like, getting into the library's institutional repository and dropping stuff in there. So I never really thought about people in rating it the institutional repository, but now I do. Anybody want to speak to that one?
I can. So one of the things that we identified in our audit was, so Digital Commons is our institutional repository, and we were still connecting via LDAP, and campus decided to start locking down using LDAP. And so that was one of the things that we couldn't have any authors upload any content, and now it is connected to our Active Directory. So it's a lot more secure. So as long as you connect uploading content via an authentication system, you're okay. And we felt at this point very secure with people trying to, if they, we always have different checks anyway, if someone's trying to upload something. So that was just one thing that really helped us, was changing that protocol.
Nice. Heather, there's a personal one for you. They want to know what you do as far as browsers go. Where's the safe territory here?
Well, that's it's not that simple a question, unfortunately. I mean, primarily I use Firefox, but Firefox doesn't work for all the sites I go to. Sometimes I have to use Chrome, and this is me speaking about my desktop usage. When a quick but important digression: browsers are what you see, and they are built on top of a browser engine. There are more browsers than there are browser engines. And Apple in particular if you run a browser on an iPad or iOS device, are you running Chrome on iPad? Are you running Firefox? Are you running Brave on iPad? It doesn't matter. Whatever browser you're running on an iPad or an iOS, you're using the same browser engine that Safari uses. And that means you're subject to the same limitations that Safari has on those devices. So when I'm on my iPad, I am using effectively Safari no matter what browser I'm using.
Okay. This may be for, I don't know, Daniel or Emily or both, and it has to do with those people who your campus knows them, but they're not straight up staff, students, current people on the campus. They're alumni. They're maybe emeritus, and it depends on how you treat emeritus faculty. They have some or had some legitimate tie, but we used to get asked as a publisher all the time to offer certain kind of alumni services and certain kind of alumni access and things like that. And boy, it was always tricky. And I thought to myself, this poor university, do they really want to? a place like, Ann Arbor, do they want to be, they got more alumni than anybody. They want to be handling all of that kind of stuff too. What do you think about, security issues relating to those people on the edges?
Well, the alumni question, I think there's two different questions here. I'll answer it two different ways. One is around alumni that are, now becoming more arm's length to the institution. But the other is visiting professors, people who aren't directly part or walk-up users that are not directly part of the university, but have an active interest in what's going on in the university.
Mm-hmm.
And I think those are two different pieces. I'll talk to the first one, Emily, and you're nodding your head. Why don't you talk to the second one? But I think the alumni question it's actually one that's being addressed thanks to licensing issues. We're seeing people like, many institutions use Office 365. We're seeing Microsoft come through and redefine some of their licensing parameters, including for Active Directory, that those accounts are held in, and sort of forcing institutions to make what now is a financial decision on how they want to extend that access to people post-graduation. Or post-employment. The emeritus definition is often codified in contract, so that helps to define that, but it can be implemented in licensing. But I think many are taking alumni and moving them down to very minimal access, even if it's just for email through a connection to maintain a connection to the institution. But in some cases, they're actually segmenting them off into their own set of email that's detached from the university, so that if something gets compromised there, it doesn't give them a path back to the institution as a whole.
And I would say that's the same for what's happening for us. First of all, we don't license anything for alumni, as much as they keep begging for that, but we don't. And students have access after they graduate just for a very limited period of time. Where we do run into issues is with visiting faculty, or in our case, we have preceptors across the state who work with students on their clinical rotations, and we do provide access to them because they're providing an educational service. And we are in the process right now of taking what they used to have a little bit more access to different things, and we're putting them in a separate group. Campus is putting them in a separate group, so they will only have limited access to resources such as the library and not other things. So I think that will help. And they're doing the same thing with emeritus faculty. I would say there was a question that came up, and I had mentioned earlier to some of you, I just came from a campus leadership meeting where we were talking about phishing attacks, and they showed the number of users on the university side whose credentials they had clicked on a link, gave up some information compared to the clinical side. And it was kind of embarrassing. They pulled up the list of the departments, if it was a student or a faculty. And unfortunately, the library was one of 23 in the last few months, and it was one of our faculty members. And the question was asked, well, are these repeat offenders? And the answer was yes, most of them have repeatedly done this. And I think that what they're going to do is start passing along this information as it happens to the deans or directors or the leaders of a major unit, so that we can, I don't want to say make an example of them, but to show, not only tell us so that we can make sure that they go through proper training, but also have them speak to the rest of our units on how they fell victim to something that looked harmless. And so I was pretty embarrassed to see our list on there. So even though we do a lot of education, we're just as at risk as anyone.
I used to work
and the
at
attackers are just that good.
They are, though, to be really open and blunt about it. I used to work at some R1 institutions, and the biggest single cybersecurity risk was absolutely the faculty. And we were explicitly told that we were not allowed to do anything. We were not allowed to do a mass email to faculty saying, this is what a phishing attempt looks like. Don't fall. You weren't allowed to do any kind of education targeted at faculty because they might get offended.
I actually have a question for Susie. If you're like me, Susie, you listen to the presentations and you thought to yourself, I have got to get to know my IT and network security people better. But you said that you started to get some presentations from them. Are you thinking you'll build that relationship more?
Yeah, actually that's such a perfect question, because I was just typing into the chat to ask all of you experts, what are some ways that you think either faculty or specifically librarians or library staff can work together with their IT departments to facilitate, greater connections and to get that information to other faculty and staff. I know here we have reached out to individual members of the ITS department with specific questions. So we'll ask something about access. We'll ask about, can you help us to set up, a link which will have a certain expiration date. We're also very excited because we recently had a new ITS staff member come on board, and we've had some really good communications. And this person also is interested in crossing over and becoming a librarian. So we're like, perfect, yes, join the
Okay.
party. We have cookies. But do you have any tips on any of the panelists have tips on how librarians can reach out, or specific questions they can ask of their IT departments and technology experts?
Ooh, good question.
It's a great question. I mean, I think one is and as the CISO of an institution, I try to go into those with hey, let me sit down with me, tell me about your world, tell me about what you're doing and how you're doing it, and how can we help you do what you do better, not focusing on the things like how can we block things, how can we make it more difficult, but what are the things that are focused on, and how can security make those things stronger. And I think you can replace the word security with library and have the reverse conversation and vice versa. But I think it all starts with just talking and, walking in and saying, let's start talking. Because I was part of what is now Seamless Access many years ago when it was getting started. And the biggest thing we heard was from librarians saying, my security officer hates me, or my security officer doesn't understand what we do or why it's so important that we do these things. So I think that right there is an opportunity to say, hey, would love to sit down and talk with you, tell you a little bit about each other. I'll tell you a little bit in a couple of minutes about some work we're doing with EDUCAUSE to try and actually fuel this and give some primers to each of those different groups, IT, information security, and university libraries, to start to understand each other better and work together better. So so more on that later, but I think it just starts with, hey, can we talk?
That sounds like a pretty good start anyway. There is a question here, I think, Dan, that you want to take a shot at as well. It's about hacked workarounds, things like fake press releases and stuff like that.
Oh yeah, and this is a derivative, I think, of the question that was asked earlier around the risks, not just to content access, but the risks to the university's image, the university's brand, based on attacks. So maybe using the library as a vector, using something else as a vector. So there are a lot of risks to inappropriate content being placed out there. Maybe it's a change in a website that makes a different perspective of what the university stands for. Maybe it's a change in a piece of research data that then has issues, results in retracted works later, or it's never identified and the outcomes are misused. The security goes beyond the security of research. The security of the university go way beyond just accessing of content. It really is all about how do we make sure that the things we're doing are genuine and that the integrity is remained all the way through their life cycle. And if something is, we have the ability to understand that it happened, what happened, and how do we undo it in a timely manner to be able to keep and ensure the integrity. Because what's the best way to lose future lose future grants, lose future research opportunities, to have your existing or previous research called into question, either as a researcher or as an institution.
Okay, got it. And there are some other questions, but we're getting close to the end. And I think that the last one I'd like to do in before we talk about SNSI is it really was directed for Emily. What were the most important relationships on your campus and the most compelling arguments in creating solutions exposed by the security audit? Who did you have to bond with?
Everyone.
Everyone, big bonding.
I mean, everyone in IT. It wasn't just the chief information officer. It was the group that manages the servers in the data center. Just in terms of talking about what do we do with some of the, for example, with our ILS server. I would say the other thing is everyone who handles just different authentication and making sure that our access to Active Directory is set up. They did an audit of every single system software package that across the institution, and who are the people who are leads for those. And so really, when we took a list at that and we saw that people from different departments were listing things such as Google, we thought you don't understand what software is. And so we actually helped them create a guide to say, this is what you're really talking about, and not just common websites that everyone uses. But really, it goes back to what Daniel just said. It's about developing the relationships and really explaining what we're about and how we serve everyone on the education, clinical, and research sides, and also how we have partnerships with the other campuses in the University of Nebraska system. So anything that happened to us would also affect something on their end, and making sure that they were aware of that. We also realized just the limitations that they faced just because of the security audit. They had thousands of things that they had to address, not just at the library, but everywhere else. So who were the resources that we could bring in? And so that's why, for example, with digital preservation, we immediately moved our data storage for special collections from their campus to something that's managed by the entire University of Nebraska system, because we knew that they had the personnel that were available and could do the backups that we needed. But it's still an ongoing conversation, and we just touch base with them all of the time.
Okay, and on that note, I'm going to ask ACRL Choice friends to switch the slides and let Dan finish up with a little talk about SNSI.
While y'all do the slide switch, you know, if there's any speaker feedback that the audience would be willing to share, I know there's usually a survey after one of these things. The speakers find that insanely useful, because I'm constantly improving this particular talk because the information is always changing. And if there's anything I can do to make it more clear, it can only help. So feedback would be appreciated.
Thanks, Heather. So I'll be brief. We just have a couple minutes left, but I just want to talk about SNSI and the this particular project. So this is a joint collaboration between university librarians, university information security teams, publishers, to try and improve just the overall state of the overall defense that we have as an industry against network issues, against crime, against breach attempts and more. And so this is a bigger program, but one of the things that I'm really focused on, and I mentioned it earlier, is some of the work we're doing, having spent time in both sides of the world, in both the publishing and in the institution. For me, it's really important that we get to understand each other. And one of the areas, as I mentioned a couple of minutes ago, is that, you know, there's often this just lack of understanding or misunderstanding about what the intents are and how to go about getting to a good result for the institution when it comes to security, when it comes to privacy, when it comes to library access and content, when it comes to availability of systems and integrity of data. And So what we've started, one of the things we've started doing is with EDUCAUSE. And if any of you are going to be at the EDUCAUSE meeting in 2 weeks, let me know. We're having a session on this as well there. But the goal here is to work on trying to improve the relationship. Like there's nothing else beneath this other than how do libraries get to understand the world of information security better? How does information security get to understand the world of the library better? How do we make it so that when the discussion comes up, we stop hearing the answer of, I don't know the IT people, I don't know the security people, I don't want to talk to them, they don't understand me, they just say no. My CISO hates me, things like, or the library, they just want to do things willy-nilly. I've heard all of these. And if I do what I want to do correctly and what this group wants to do correctly, we can stop having that be the reason why things can't proceed. Excuse me. We had a first meeting a couple weeks ago, had 30 institutions from around the US, big, small, east, west. We have CISOs, we have CIOs, we have librarians, we have technologists within the libraries. We have a whole bunch of different people that are participating to try and share their opinions, share their experiences in how they've built good relationships across these areas, and how they have and how they've struggled, so we can try and help people across the way. So if you're interested in that, there is an EDUCAUSE group called Library IT and Security Partnerships. If you're an EDUCAUSE member, please join that. If you're interested in more information about SNSI, which goes way beyond that, it involves technical controls, it involves education, it involves partnering together to try and come up with systems that work well across libraries, between published content, libraries, this information security teams. Please check out snsi.info or get in touch with me, and I can talk about any of those initiatives with you. And there's the EDUCAUSE information. Good. Thanks. That's all I have.
Okay. I think we're at the end of our time. There are always more questions. There's been a lot of flurries of back and forth in the question area, which is great. But I hope everybody enjoyed the day, and I think our speakers did a wonderful job and gave of their time. And I thank Susie for coming in and telling us a little bit about her life on the West Coast, and Allen Hancock College, and I appreciate the hosting by ACRL Choice. And I'll let Sabrina finish.
Thanks, Bob. Thank you again to our presenters for presenting today. It's definitely a very valuable and timely discussion. I'd like to remind our viewers that we recorded today's program, so be on the lookout for a follow-up email from Choice and ACRL with a link to the recording. Also, if you have a few minutes after the presentation to fill out a brief survey that Heather mentioned, we'd really appreciate it. Your responses help us improve our presentations. So thank you again for joining us today. We hope you learned something from the session, and we hope to see you again in the near future on another webinar.
Thanks.